Hi, I'm Hari from Group 101. Now I'm here going to speak about the behaviorism. Behaviorism is also known as the behavioral psychology, is a theory learning based on the idea that all the behaviors are acquired through the conditioning or the conditioning occurs through the interaction with the environment. Behaviorists believe that our actions are shaped by the environmental stimuli. The example for the behavioralism is when the teacher reward their class or the certain student with a party or the special treat at the end of the week of the good behavior throughout the week. The same concept can be used for the punishments. The teacher can take away the certain privileges if the student misbehaves. There are three types of the behaviorism. Methodological behavior should be studied without connection to the mental states. Psychological human and animal behavior is explained based on the external physical stimuli. Analytical or logical. Certain behaviors will arise from the particular mental states and beliefs. There are two types of the behaviorism. Methodological behaviorism means the methodological behaviorism which always heavily influenced, which was influenced by the John B. Watson. And another is radical behaviorism, which was pioneered by the psychologist B.F. Skinner. The key theories of the behaviorism is the ideas that all the behaviors are learned through interaction with the environment. This learning theory states that the behaviors are learned from the environment and says that the state and or inherited factor have very little influence on the behavior. The behaviorism is used for, you can ask a question like for what the behaviorism is used for. These principles are used today to treat mental health challenges such as phobias or PTSD. Exposure therapy, for example, aims to weaken conditioned response to the certain fear stimuli. Appeal behavior analysis (ABA), a therapy used to treat is based on the behaviorist principles. What are the principles of behavioralism? This behavioralism focuses on the idea that all behaviors are learned through interaction with the environment.
Roots of behaviorism. Behaviorism has its roots as far back as the ancient Greeks. Hippocrates, known as the father of the medicine, developed humors consisting of four humors that corresponded with four temperaments, that is, physician and philosopher used his model with its four temperaments for many long years. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle are often spoken of together due to the unique relationship they shared. Aristotle was the student of Plato, who was in turn the student of Socrates, and it is their development in philosophy, a precursor to modern psychology, that began to lay the seeds for what would one day develop into behaviorism. Modern psychology that began to lay the seeds for what would one day develop into behaviorism. Socrates began by teaching the need to examine in order to know the truth. In contrast, his view was one of a mind and body consisting of a single entity, while he acknowledged Descartes' view of mind controlling voluntary action. He expanded this to include all human activity. Locke further discounted the work of Descartes as well as that of Plato. He maintained that all ideas originated in one's experiences. A newborn is devoid of ideas until experience began to form these ideas. Another Leninist association, Hume joined Hobbes and Locke in their rejection of Descartes' ideas. In contrast to Descartes' rationalism, Hume came to believe desire was the driving force behind human behavior and not the reason. The seed of behaviorism can be seen here if one can associate desire with a condition. Behaviorism can be described and explained without making reference to mental events or to internal psychological processes. The source of behavior are internal, in the environment, not internal, the mind. This is a research program in psychology called psychological behaviorism. It purports to explain human and animal behavior in terms of external physical stimuli, responses, learning histories, and reinforcement. A significant piece of several psychological theories in the late 19th century was introspection, which is the examination of observation of one's mental and emotional processes. In retort to this theory, behaviorism came about. Behaviorism is predominantly concerned with observable and measurable aspects of human behavior. In other words, behaviorism does not look at the biological aspects, but it suggests that all behaviors are learned habits and changes in response to the environment. It endeavors to explain how these particular habits are formed. Behaviorism claimed that the cause of behavior was not necessarily found in the complexities of the mind, but could be observed in the one's immediate environment from stimuli that produce, reinforced, and punished certain responses, also known later on as conditioning. It wasn't until the 20th century that the scientists began to discover the actual system to learning, thereby laying a foundation for behaviorism. A theorist system to learning, thereby laying a foundation of behaviorism. Like a theorist by the name of Ivan Pavlov was a major contribution to the discovery of significant behavioral theories. For example, here one mind map is given of behavioral theories, which is again divided into three subdivisions of classical conditioning, connectionism, operant conditioning. This classical conditioning is given by Ivan Pavlov, connectionism is given by Edward Thorndike, operant conditioning is given by Skinner. This classical conditioning focuses mainly on involuntary behaviors, whereas the operant conditioning focuses on voluntary behaviors. This connectionism is different from these two theories, like connectionism depends on trial and error method. This connectionism, classical conditioning and operant conditioning is again divided into their own subdivision. For example, operant conditioning is divided into subdivisions like primate principle, backward chaining, punishment, reinforce. This reinforcement is again divided into categories like primary and secondary. And there are two types of reinforcement, that is positive and negative reinforcement. And the principle included under the operant conditioning is generalization, discrimination and extinction. Now, let's talk about the classical conditioning, which focuses on the involuntary behaviors. It includes the elements like stimulus and responses. These two occur together in the elements of classical conditioning. And then the conditional emotional reaction occur in the classical conditioning are instinctive and reflexive. These all theories, their subdivisions work together to form a behavioral theories and the roots of behavioral theories. The behavioral theory that I chose was the behaviorist learning theory. This theory is based on the idea that the behavior can be researched through scientific methods and without a recourse on your inner mental state. The science of behaviors is a subject matter. Behaviors is the name for that part of the functioning of an organism that consists of its interacting or having commerce with its surrounding environmental circumstances. One assumption of all the behaviorist learning theory is that free will is imagined and that all behavior is determined by the environment either through affiliation or reinforcement. Behaviorism is a branch of psychology, and some statement made about behaviorism is that it deals with the behavior and not the mind. Behaviorism is looked at as a separate entity and can be explained without directly mentioning mental events or the peer-reviewed article that choose from the Kaplan Library about the behaviorist learning theory is about behavioral and social theories and considering human behaviors within the cultural and social context of individuals and families can be allowed. The article is a synopsis of how both the behavioral and the social learning theory influence our behaviors. The social learning theory is used in behavioral science as well as mental health inventories. Our culture helps in shaping our human behaviors and our social environment. Behavioral therapy warrants the use of evidence-based practices that are geared. The classical origins of Pavlov's conditioning is one of its examples. Integrative psychological and behavioral science natural processes is also included in that. As shown in the mind map, the behaviorism has psychological roots and philosophical roots, which are mainly realism, materialism, and reductionism. Realism is the study of particular behavior, and materialism regards man as a material object, that is, materialistic object. Reductionism associates human activities with behavioral response of animals. Now, the popularity of behaviorism. Why is behaviorism attractive? Three reasons stand out in explaining the popularity of behaviorism. All of the reasons for the popularity of behaviorism point to its innately scientific nature. For example, first, psychological problems are defined. Behaviorism assumes that psychological distress is due to unhealthy or dysfunctional behavior. Behavior can be symptomatic of psychological problems. Psychological problems can be identified through diagnostic methods such as the DSM-4. Next, the perspectives on the influence of cognitions, mental states, or belief on behavior vary with the theory from little influence under Skinner's positive behaviorism to the syncretism. Second, the systematic treatment plans are essential. Therapeutic dialogue is important in revealing the problem, but therapy ultimately guides the client towards the treatment plan. Treatment plans incorporate small steps of behavioral change towards mental health. Simply choosing to believe a certain way or creating one's own perception of stimuli does not impact one's quality of life until beliefs or perceptions are acted upon. Third, progress is measurable in behaviorism theory. A strong advocate for behaviorism is the ability to measure progress. Behaviorism offers behavioral markers that allow the client and everyone to know if the client is making progress or not. Behaviorism in progress can be measured through success in accomplishing the different steps of the treatment plan. For example, William, reality therapy is cognitive behavioral theory. Part of the treatment plan process is the client generates much of the plan and contracts with the therapist to achieve certain predetermined goals by a set time or a client experienced self-identified consequences. All of this is a part of the contract between client and counselor. Theories of people like William Gesser's reality theories and choice therapy helps to understand this. The role of behavior in shaping one's life should not be discounted. Much of what a person experiences in life is a product of his or her behavior. However, poor behaviorism tends to discount the role of beliefs or modeling by others, and this appears to be a weakness of the theory. In other words, creating the perfect situation in terms of reward does not guarantee an organism will demonstrate desired behavior. Where is behaviorism used today? This is the most important question arising in everyone's mind. Created with Sketch, behaviorist principles are sometimes used today to treat mental health challenges such as phobias or personality stimulus disease. Exposure therapy, for example, aims to weaken conditional response to certain feared stimuli. From about 1920 through the mid-1950s, the behaviorism grew to become the dominant school of thought in psychology. Some suggest that the popularity of behavioral psychology grew out of the desire to establish psychology as an objective and measurable science. Behaviorism emerged in the early 1900s as a reaction to deep psychology and other traditional forms of psychology, which often had a difficulty making prediction that could be tested experimentally but derived from earlier research in the late 19th century, such as when Edward Thorndike pioneered the law. Watson is known as the father of behaviorism within psychology. John Watson was an influential American psychologist whose most famous work occurred during the early 20th century at Johns Hopkins University. Behaviorist credits journals, organized societies, and founded psychology graduated programs reflective of behaviorism. Behaviorists organized themselves into different types of research clusters whose difference stemmed from such factors as varying approaches to conditioning and experimentation. Some clusters are named as follows: the experimental analysis of behavior, behavior analysis, functional analysis, and of the titles of the behaviorism leading societies and journals, including the Society for the Advancement of Behavior Analysis and the journal The Experimental Analysis of Behavior, as well as the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. In the example of my belief that I have a 2 p.m. dental appointment, one must also speak of my desire to arrive at 2 p.m. Otherwise, the behavior of arriving at 2 p.m. could not count as believing that I have a 2 p.m. appointment. The term desire is a mental term. Critics of analytical behaviorism have changed that we can never escape from using mental terms in a characterization of the meaning of mental terms. This suggests that mental
So let's talk about the mouse Ethiopia experiment, which was done by John Beaglehorn. Actually, this experiment. So let's talk about the mouse Ethiopia experiment, which was done by John Beaglehorn. Actually, this experiment was conducted on behavioral sync, which was the term invented by himself to describe, to acknowledge the behavior of people due to overcrowding. The term and the concept derive from a series of overpopulation experiments Calhoun conducted on Norway rats between 1958 and 1962. Calhoun experiment, which was started with rats and outdoor pen and moved onto mice at National Institute of Mental Health during the early 1960s, were interpreted as the time has evidence of what could happen in overpopulated world. So this was observed in behavioral sync. After Calhoun wrote about his finding in Scientific American 1962 that according to paper published in the Journal of Social History, the work tapped into era's feeling of dread that crowded urban areas always have the risk of moral decay and events like murder of Kitty. In this experiment, many rats were experimented. At first, it was 30 to 56 rats placed at that Montgomery County, and then he separated into 4 rooms, and every room was specifically created to support the rats, and they were provided with all the unlimited resources such as water, food, and also protection from the predator and from also weathers and disease. After some days, at beginning it was supporting the population to be increased, but after the 600th day of the experiment, the population was on its way to extinction. And from this experiment, the study confirmed that the hypothesis based on the earlier study. Hello, now we are going to talk about why be a behaviorist. As we know that behaviorism is an attitude of behavior that is acquired through conditioning, and conditioning occurs through the interaction with the environment. Actually, there are many reasons for the behaviorist to why be a behaviorist, but there are 3 main reasons. First, it is epistemic or the evidential. Second, the difference between the mentalistic and associationist. And the third, it is to avoid circular and regressive explanation of behavior. So first of all, to talk about the epistemic or evidential reason, it's all about the evidence, the conceptual space or step between the claim that behavior warrants the attribution of belief and claim to believe in behavior itself is the first reason. And if the mental state attribution bears a special connection with behavior, it is tempting to say that mentality just consists in behavioral tendency. Next, to talk about the reason to why to be a behaviorist, it is the reason is the major difference between the mentalistic and associationist. It is the conditioning of behavior of mental. It is true even though there may be nothing about mentalistic accounts. It is only about that tend to assume hypotheses that the mind possesses at the birth or innately a set of procedure or internally represented processing rules which are deployed when learning or acquiring new responses. This is what about the second reason. And to say in short, behaviorism therefore appeals to the theorists who deny that there are innate rules by which organism learns. And the third reason why we are behaviorists is to avoid the circular and regressive explanation of behavior. Here, majorly Skinner played a major role in this theory, and Skinner's skepticism about explanatory reference to mental inerness may be described here.
And its goal is to promote the scientific study of behavior. The behavior in particular or individual organisms, not of social groups, not of cultures, but of person and animals. So let's first talk about what is behaviorism. One has to be careful with ism word. So they often have both loose and strict meanings, and sometimes multiple meaning of each type. Behaviorism is no exception. So Wilfred Sellars, the distinguished philosopher, noted that a person may qualify as a behaviorist loosely or attitudinally speaking if they insist on confirming hypotheses and psychological events in a term of behavioral criteria. So, arguably, there is nothing truly existing about behaviorism loosely understood. It annothrones behavioral evidence and agreeable, inescapable premises, not just in psychological science but in ordinary discourse about mind and behavior. So, there are three types of behaviorism. First one is methodological behaviorism. It is a normative theory about the scientific conduct of psychology. It claims that psychology should concern itself with the behavior of organism. And second one is psychological behavior. So it is a research program within psychology. It purports to explain human and animal behavior in terms of external physical stimuli, responses, learning histories, and reinforcements. And the third one is analytical or logical behaviorism. It is a theory with the philosophy about the meaning of semantics of mental term or concepts. It says that the very idea of a mental state or condition is the idea of behavioral disposition or family of so let's now talk about roots of behaviorism. So each of mythological, psychological or analytical behaviorism has historical foundations. Analytical behaviorism traces its historical roots to the philosophical movement known as logical positivism. And logical positivism proposes that the meaning of statements used in science must be understood in terms of experimental conditions or observations that verify their truth. And psychological behaviorism historical roots consists so in part in the classical associatism of British empiricist forecast John Locke and David Hume, and popularity of behaviorism. So behaviorism of one sort or another was an immensely popular research program for methodological commitment among students of behavior from about the third decade of the 20th century through its middle decades. At least until the beginning of the conjugative science revolution. And among psychologists, behaviorism was even more popular than among philosophers. So, in addition to Pavlo, Skinner's, and Watson, the list of behaviorists and Skinner's social worldview. So Skinner is only major figure in the history of behaviorism to offer a psychopolitical worldview based on its commitment to behaviorism. And critics have raised several objections to the Skinner's social picture. One of the most prescriptive and certainly one of the most frequent, and science for him more or less just identifies organism physical process that underlie animal environment and interactions. So and the conclusion, what the conclusion